Hey, so my name's Chris. I'm from Swinburne University. I'm a bit of a robot geek, amongst other things. And what I thought I'd do, obviously I want to talk about robots, and in particular a project that we've been working on for a few years now at Swinburne with Royal Children's Hospital, developing software for that robot over there to be a therapeutic aid for children going through pediatric or rehabilitation. But what I thought I'd do first is give a little bit of background to myself and generally the field of social robotics, which is kind of broadly what I'm talking about when I'm talking about that application. So if I can work out this. No. Yeah, here we go. So actually my real passion is for pixels. I really like working with images and trying to work out what the hell is going on in the world using pixels. And in my PhD work, which was probably about 10 years ago now, I was particularly interested in bio-inspired computer vision. So that is trying to design algorithms for robots to basically take great ideas from evolved eye systems like insects, in particular the honeybee. I spent a lot of time learning about honeybees and how they view the world, and then trying to apply some of those techniques on a robot. One of the key things about honeybees is that they have this obviously big field of view, but also if you look at the geometry of that projection of the world, you actually learn a lot about how they process particularly motion information, because on a big sphere, motion kind of projects in a particular way that makes it easier to interpret than would be on a standard camera that we often use in robotics. So a lot of my early work was sort of looking around bio-inspired computer vision. And then I took some of those algorithms, and one of the really lucky things for me was being able to be part of a big project which was based here in Melbourne called the Bionic Eye Project, where I was interested in using the same types of computer vision algorithms but trying to apply it to a retinal prosthesis. So this is for people who have lost sight due to diseases like retinitis pigmentosa, age-related macular degeneration, but they still have, the key thing is they still have a connection with the brain. And we can stimulate it electrically using a little implant at the back of the retina, and we take images from a head-mounted camera, and we process those images to try and provide some sort of visualization that they can use to navigate with. This is obviously implant recipients. So I used a lot of my ideas from robotics to try and come up with interesting ways, and obviously useful ways, to project the world to people with a retinal implant. So that's some of the stuff I've been doing. Another topic that I'm talking about tonight, and this is really, for me, a more recent area of interest, is human-robot interaction. And this really combines a lot of things that I have been interested in the past, in terms of obviously robotics, and vision is very much a part of that as well. But also, as I'll talk about, in the healthcare sector, I've become very interested in how we apply AI and particularly computer vision and generally robotics in that space through looking at how, in my bionic eye experience, I could see how that multidisciplinary research was really quite an inspiring place to be. So I've certainly found myself still doing that kind of work. Now, when we're talking about human-robot interaction, we're really talking about how we design AI systems to assist, but also we're really talking about how we design software to team up with humans and assist them in particular ways, right? And we're not talking about so much physical, but rather, having an interface between you and the machine that makes sense and does the job. And if we look at that field, one of the big questions that still really needs to be addressed is, how do we actually make systems that are robust enough to be deployed? There's a lot of work in proof of concept, a lot of theory, and that's great work, but the next step has to be about how we make these systems actually something we can put in the home or put in a hospital, wherever we're trying to do this kind of work. And so a lot of the work I've been focused on in the last few years, along with my PhD student Philippe, who's here, is looking at that kind of problem. Now, we've actually been thinking about this for quite some time, in terms of having robots that could engage with humans. And if you go right back to the 50s, we see examples like Robbie the robot here, who first appeared in The Forbidden Planet and then had a cameo in Columbo for some reason, among other things. And, we were already thinking, even then, about the idea of a robot that could be obviously in the home or engaging with humans. So we had a good concept already of what we wanted. And then we project a little bit forward to the 80s. This is one of the bizarre moments of the 80s, I think. The Rocky movies I like the Rocky movies. I'm not ashamed to admit it. Rocky IV was a bit of a low point, but this robot appeared, if you might remember it only had a few minutes. This is Paulie. Paulie is Rocky's brother-in-law. Rocky, by this stage, is a fairly successful boxer. He's quite rich. He buys his brother-in-law a robot. Paulie then reprograms the robot to be his girlfriend, so-called girlfriend. I don't know what his degree was or how he was able to do that, but this is the robot. As it turned out, now at the time I was 8 years old. I just thought, cool robot. Then I woke up about 20 years later and thought, what the hell was that? What was this robot? And then I did a little bit of investigating. This robot actually has a bit of a story. The inventor was a guy called Robert Dorwich, I'm going to say. I can't remember. Anyway, it was an actual robot designed to work with kids on the autism spectrum. This is in the 80s. Now, if you project forward to today, this is one of the major application areas of social robots. Yet this guy was in the 80s thinking about this. As it turned out, Sylvester Stallone has a son on the autism spectrum, saw this on a talk show, thought, that sounds cool, I'll buy it. And he also struck up a relationship with the inventor, and of course it ended up on the movie. Bizarrely on the movie, but it was on the movie. And it also got a mention in The Family Guy as well, which I thought was cool too. Just fascinating. Now, this is the 80s, of course. One of the things unfortunately about robotics is it's been a bit of a slow burn. A lot of promise, but not a lot of delivery, right? We've got a vacuum robot. That's about the best we've got in the home right now. But really, we promised a lot more. And AI researchers, generally, and people in the field, there was a bit of a dark age in the 90s where we hadn't really realised the promises, and people kind of forgot about us for a while. But there's been a recent resurgence, which I think is quite interesting. And it's really been driven by a bunch of different things, which we can talk about a little bit. But now we have a whole bunch of robots which are commercially available. The Now robot is actually, that robot's there is actually called Jaime. But of course, it's a commercially available robot, one of the more successful ones out there. And there's a whole bunch of others. Now, if we look at these robots now, they don't look much like those big industrial-sized robots we were dreaming of in the 50s. They're quite a lot smaller. A lot of them are designed almost, obviously to be quite cute, quite engaging, and that's kind of the point. And one of the other things we've also seen in recent times is that not all robots have to look like robots at all. They can be cute, they can huggable, tactile. They have to, often if we're thinking about particularly applications with children, it doesn't really make sense to have some big bulky robot that can take out the child in one swipe, right? So we need to be thinking like that too. So there's a lot of interest in how we design robots to be safe, compliant in terms of the skin that they have, that sort of thing. So we've come a fair way from the 50s in terms of what we're getting now. Although, again, like I say, we haven't quite realised yet perhaps what we really want, which is those robots in our homes that are doing the vacuuming. Well, maybe they are doing the vacuuming, but making us coffee and things like this. If I talk about social robots, though, I think I haven't really defined what I mean by that. This picture here I really like, because if you compare this picture to that guy there, This robot looks incredibly social in the sense that it is very engaging, it's got a posture, it's got eye gaze straight at us, versus the robot over there, which is obviously switched off, very inanimate, completely non-social, right? Clearly it matters how we design software in terms of how we make the robot look, how it feels, how it moves itself is going to matter in terms of how we want it to engage with people. And a lot of research is in this space about how we design software to create that kind of sense of social engagement. The other reason it's interesting to study this stuff is because, frankly, we learn a lot about ourselves. And a lot of the research in this field is also interested in human responses to robots. And that's an interesting application area itself. The application area that I care about is healthcare. I'm just going to skip through this just because I'm taking time where I don't want to take time. But the challenge is actually, first, I'll just say, doing social robots is hard, right? And it's hard for a bunch of reasons. These are all areas of research that are going on. My area is computer vision, as I said. And in my field, we've had a lot of interesting developments in the last 10 years, driven mostly by deep neural networks and the idea that we can basically train systems to do what they do rather than explicitly code them. We've had a lot of interesting outcomes come out of that. But even so, same with natural language processing, lots of advances. But so far, most of this hasn't really completely made it to the deployed robots we see out there in the world. In terms of healthcare, which is the application I want to talk about tonight, we've seen actually quite a lot of interesting recent research showing potential benefits of using social robots in particular settings. Medicine dispensing is something that was thought of early, and that's obviously about simply making efficiencies, right? Where we can use a robot instead of a nurse or a doctor. Obviously, we're going to gain something out of that in terms of saving of resources. But more interesting applications are around, for example, the bottom image here, in terms of aged care. So, particularly around dementia, we've seen this robot here, Paro. Have I got a pointer? I don't know if I've got a pointer. I won't worry about a pointer. Anyway, you can see the bottom image, it's right there. So Paro, the robot seal, is probably the most commercially successful social robot out there. It doesn't do much. It kind of wiggles when you pat it. It does a few little responsive things, but for the most part, it's just there to be cute and engaging. And it's had an incredible impact on aged care, and it's being taken up quite widely as obviously a way of engaging cognitively with perhaps people who need that stimulation, particularly people with dementia. Other settings have also been looked at in terms of counselling, in oncology and things like this. The idea that the robot is there as a kind of a social mediator. Often kids, and as I said earlier, autism spectrum disorder is another classic use of social robots where we're seeing particularly interesting ways they're applied to engage children who perhaps don't want to engage with the adult directly but are very happy to talk to a robot. And that's what has been looked at a lot. Now, that's great, but in terms of healthcare, while there's been an incredible number of studies that have looked at the possibility, there was a recent paper, this only came out about 2 weeks ago, that did a survey of social robots currently in healthcare. Only 27 have actually done any sort of clinical trials, which is actually not that many. Considering what the boom is at the moment, there's a lot of interest in it, but only a very few number of randomised controlled studies. These are like the gold standard, right, for clinical effectiveness of these devices. So not that many. Clearly, the conclusion of that paper was we need more. We need more clinical trials. Well, sure, we do, of course. But are we actually ready to do it? And I think that for me, as someone in the field, that's where my question is I don't think we can do clinical trials until we have robots that actually perform what they're meant to do, robustly, reliably, and actually address the needs. And that's actually a really big question and probably needs a lot more investigation. So in our work at Swinburne, in partnership with the Royal Children's Hospital, we've been trying to explore what it takes to actually get a robot to perform as a therapeutic aid, in our case for rehab, which is another big area where social robots have a potential role to play. And the idea is we're not really focused around the AI aspect of this problem. Obviously, there's a lot you could do in terms of computer vision. You can watch how the actions of a patient perform versus what you expect and give feedback. We're not so focused on that, but rather just on the basics of a social presence of a robot and how it might engage a child during what is a pretty stressful situation and quite uncomfortable. We have a big team of people, multidisciplinary. As I said, I love being in this space. We've got technical people like Philippe, myself at Swinburne. We've got Joe Butchart, who's here as a senior physiotherapist at the RCH, and we've got a whole bunch of other people feeding into this project. And basically what we've worked on mostly is dealing with patients with cerebral palsy. And one of the things we were looking at was how we might be able to improve outcomes, in particular for rehab that is often done after what we call single event multi-level surgery. This is surgery that is done typically early in life so that the child has any musculoskeletal corrections made as they're growing. But because of obviously that being surgery, we have to do a pretty intense period of rehab after that. And that rehab often is done as an inpatient and maybe up to multiple sessions a day, maybe 3. A couple of those sessions with a therapist, but often sessions will also happen after hours with a nurse or a parent. And those are the sessions which, if you talk to physiotherapists, they'll say, we don't really think much happens in those ones. That could be up to 1/3 of the total rehab care given. So this is quite a significant amount. So the question is, can we use a social robot in that context to improve outcomes, in particular adherence or compliance? That is, can we get children doing more exercises if they have a robot in the room that's encouraging them, motivating them, and so on, trying to obviously give them a better experience. But also emotional well-being. Can we reduce the anxiety, the depression scores that we often can measure through these types of studies and see if we can make a difference? That's the kind of idea we're looking at with Robot Like Now over there. So we have this design question though, because while I can say, yes, that sounds like a great idea, we should, that sounds great, we've got to make it something that's actually usable, something that's deployable in a real hospital. The Royal Children's Hospital is a busy place. Robots that don't work probably don't have much of a lifespan there. So we have to think about how to design a human-robot interaction system that actually works. For that reason, we have to think about what kind of AI and what kind of software in general we actually need versus what is superfluous to that. And a lot of our research has been around questions of what is the minimum need for a robot to actually have a benefit. And that's been really interesting. And so to get to the clinical question, we need that system working. So we started out with an 8-month visit every Tuesday. This was about 4 years ago. We had a TAC grant to buy us a robot. And then we went in there and we basically talked to physios, we talked to patients, we talked to parents. We hung out in the waiting area of the clinic, talking to anyone that would talk to us. We had a robot, it wasn't hard. So kids came to us. What we eventually came up with was a prototype system that basically leads 30-minute sessions of rehab. The robot is programmed with a whole bunch of exercises. It has a tablet interface which therapists can configure to make, to obviously set out the actual program of rehab for that session. And we tested it. And this is an example. I hope it's not too loud.
So Deegan, watch how I do a bridge. I am going to start lifting myself up. Notice how I hold my bottom off the ground like a bridge when I go up. Ridgy ditch, it's a bridge. Make sure you hold your bottom in the air like a bridge. Done.
So because I'm running out of time, I can't show the full video, but we will have a demo in the break if anyone wants to have a look. What we were interested in, we couldn't measure clinical benefits yet because, as I said, we wanted the system working. But what we could ask is therapists, parents, and patients what they thought of the robot in terms of how they accepted it as a technology, as an aid. We asked about the usability of it, the perceived ease of use, the perceived usefulness. We also asked about trust. We asked a whole lot of questions with a whole lot of surveys, gathered a lot of data. Over 12 months we did this at the RCH. So it was quite a few patients that we got to work with, and therapists, in fact. I won't go through the graphs, the nerdy graphs, except to say PU means perceived usefulness, the top row, and basically everyone agreed that it was useful. Everyone agreed it was easy to use, which I thought was great because the robot was not something they'd ever seen before, and with minimal training, we're able to use it. Interestingly, at the bottom, though, trust was something that was kind of a bit polarised, which is an interesting and not uncommon result for robot studies like this. We often get a whole diversity of responses. And of course, trust is an interesting question, right? What are you asking about? Are you asking about trusting the robot to do what you wanted it to do? Trusting the advice it gives? It's a complicated question, which I'd need another 20 minutes to talk about, so I can't. But ultimately, though, what we got was a lot of interesting results about what the therapists particularly, we were interested mostly in therapists as a first point and what they thought of it. I'll skip ahead. In terms of roles that the therapists thought the robot best served, they thought demonstration was the best, the fact that it actually shows the exercise. Otherwise, it's usually a printout. So this was a full 3D demonstration of exercises which they could configure, also as a motivator because the robot offers enticements like gameplay as well as dancing at the end and things like this. So these were the things they liked about it. In terms of what it didn't quite do, it didn't offer enough feedback or responsiveness to patients and when they were changing their mood or were not doing the exercise correctly. We were completely aware of this as we didn't build that into the system yet, but it's interesting and very important to identify what the needs are before we invest the research in that kind of AI because it takes a bit of work to do it right. But what we have is a good list of things we need to do for a clinical trial, and that's the point. So are we there yet? Well, no, we're not there yet. In terms of this project and a clinical trial, we've got a little way to go, but I'd say we're within about 2 years of doing one. It's really just a bunch of things we have to tick off the list. More broadly, though, there are things that are there yet. The aged care application, these robots are there. They're being deployed. And so there are areas where we're seeing these robots already deployed. Perhaps the other question, which I'm going to leave you with, because I've run out of time, is this where we want to go, right? I don't know, right? I think for rehab, I see so many benefits. I'm convinced of that being a good thing. Aged care is a funny one, maybe it's an interesting one to think about, where we're sort of outsourcing emotional support to a robot, right? Obviously, that could be a human doing that, but we've clearly identified a shortage of resources. But is that where we really want to go as a society? I don't know that answer, and I think, me, the engineer, scientist, is quite intrigued by it. Me, the grandson, less interested, maybe convinced. So I think that's an interesting question we need to think about as a society with these things obviously coming. So with that, I'll say, I just want to acknowledge the patients, parents and therapists as part of our study. We've had such great support, also our funding support in this project. And with that, I'll say thank you. Cheers.
Go to nerdnite.com to find a Nerd Night event near you. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for our latest presentation.